Madam President, it is indeed a pleasure to have the opportunity once again to join the debate in the Senate. And Madam President, I'd like to emphasize at the outset the importance of this bill and the passage of this bill, not only to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, but also to the officers, the men and women in the various services and the divisions of national security, who this bill touches their lives directly. And at the beginning, I'd like to place on record my personal thanks to the Attorney General and the former Minister of National Security, Minister Dillon, for them listening to the cries, which are the genesis of this bill, of the Prison Officers Association, and then for them doing the hard work, and I came in at the end to assist in the mopping up and the working with the Attorney General to produce this bill, but also to thank the Attorney General for piloting it this afternoon. In fact, he was surprised I'd asked him to pilot it because we're juggling a whole host of things. Madam President, lest anyone in the Senate has a disconnect, or not to use the word disconnect, but doesn't understand the genesis of this. The plain genesis of this bill came from a request of the Prison Officers Association, who felt, and rightly so, that they were under particular attack by the criminal elements in society, some of whom, unfortunately, are behind the prison walls. And it came at a time when the prison officers felt that their membership were being singled out by certain elements in the criminal empires, including behind prison walls, and targeted. And unfortunately, it led to a couple murders of prison officers. So one of the things when we met with the Prison Officer Association is they said, increase the penalties, increase the sentences for those who target prison officers. And we listened to them. And then the Attorney General, in his wisdom, turned around and said, and it forms the mantra of this particular legislation, well, if we're going to protect you in that manner, and we're going to increase the penalties in an effort to offer you that extra sense of protection, and I repeat, when we sit in this Senate and in the House, all we can do as legislators, whilst in the Parliament, is pass law. So it always amuses me to an extent when I hear persons suggest, well, all you're bringing is law. All you're bringing is legislation for debate to solve crime. That is the only thing that can be done in the Parliament. There is nothing else legally that I am aware of that parliamentarians can do to contribute to the fight against crime, apart from being advocates on the outside against crime, but most importantly, charged with the responsibility, be it in the House or be it in the Senate, to pass legislation to take the fight to crime. So to get back to the point, we said to the prison officers, if we are going to increase protection for you and your membership and your family members via legislation, it comes with the flip side of responsibility. You pick up one end of the stick, you must pick up the next end. So on the same hand, we understand, or on the other side, we understand that there are prison officers who engage in corrupt acts and activity. And this is unfortunate. And as I tell them on every occasion of interaction, once you go down that slippery slope and you cross the line once, there is no coming back. And the prison system is the perfect example of that. Because unfortunately, the prison officer who falls prey to the criminal element within the walls whilst performing his or her duties and thinks that they will take that simple one-off act to take a cell phone in or to take prohibited goods in for prisoners on that one occasion, that is the beginning of the end for them. And they're on that slippery slope, and there is no coming back out of it. Because as we see in the prison system, and we are aware, we're not burying our heads in the sand, we are aware of the difficulties taking place in the prison system. And you would have seen Madam President, as the population would have. Over the last few months, we have increased the asset base at the prison system. So we've also gotten dogs, and we thank the US government for that. That helps. We've increased the searching of persons going in and out of the prison system. And almost unfortunately, on a weekly basis, fortunately and unfortunately, on a weekly basis, you're seeing the busts of prohibited items and the attempts to get them into prison. The difference is that we're making inroads and we're actually picking up the items before they get in. So this legislation, on the flip side, increases the penalties to the prison officers if they engage in any such activity. They engage in the helping. I've heard all of the conversation. I'd like to take the opportunity, because I was listening whilst I was in my office, to Senator Sobers. I was pleasantly surprised. And when we have those types of contributions, we should say so. And we should say that as citizens, we appreciate, and no pun intended, but the sober conversation and the way that Senator Sobers presented his discourse to the Senate. And I want to place that on the Hansard. So this piece of legislation here today, as you've heard before, deals with the prisons, the police, immigration, fire, and customs. And I'd like to focus initially on the prisons. There's also a section in this proposed bill that has been passed by the House that deals with a very important, prevalent problem that we're facing in the prison system right now. And that is the use of devices, and the use of internet, and the use of social media, and the use of what is deemed here electronic communications via devices, to not only communicate directly with the outside world, but also to communicate via putting things up on social media platforms. I see Senator Sobers has returned. Senator, in your absence, I took the opportunity to tell you what a good presentation you gave and how refreshing it was. So in your presence now, I repeat it and I thank you. Don't let those water it down. So electronic communications is covered in this legislation. And I just want to tell the population that we're very aware of those both inside the prison system and those outside of the prison system who are using electronic means to communicate in an illegal manner. And the Attorney General, after listening to it and seeing the reports, brought this particular section for us to deal with it. So for the first time, we will have it as an express statutory criminal offense for the posting on social media platforms, but also the voice over internet conversations. So the WhatsApp conversations that may be taking place and these other means of communicating, which are really the continuation of the criminal empires on the outside by the criminals who are incarcerated. And as Senator Sobers said, when you're in jail, jail is for jail and it's all about jail. And he's right. And this particular section goes directly to the heart of ensuring that a jail environment is a jail environment. Because you see, despite what people may think, at the end of the day, one of the reasons for incarcerating people is to take away some of their liberty. You mustn't treat them cruelly, you mustn't treat them in an inhumane manner. And we work towards those things, the improvement of the conditions. But there must be no free flow of communication. And it is a fact that right now there is too much, because one conversation is too much. There is too much communicating going on with those in the prison system and those on the outside of the prison system. And again, it's an opportune moment to put down yet another marker that those in the prison system who are incarcerated, some of them for murder, continue to communicate with the outside world to carry on their criminal empires. And unfortunately, sometimes the people who are falling prey to being the communication tools in those instances are the lawyers in our society. And every time we say this, there's an outcry, but it is a fact. And now this legislation is a step in the right direction to criminalize that type of activity. Of course, lawyer-client privilege and confidentiality and those conversations are fine. But when you step over the line and you're now assisting in the carrying out of criminal activity and a criminal empire, that is something the authorities have requested of the government via legislation, that specific criminalization of that activity takes place. What this legislation seeks to do for the prison officers is to increase the fines, the penalties for those who attack prison officers and their families and threaten their families. But it also, as I said, at the proposed introduction of Section 8A, which falls under, I believe it is Clause 3 of this legislation. Correct, at Clause 3 of the legislation, the proposed new clause, Section 8A, it deals with trafficking in prisons by prison officers. And this is the particular section, Madam President, that I was referring to, that we're telling prison officers, don't go down that road. Don't assist in the provision of tools for the carrying out of criminal activity. So if you do so, we're increasing the fines and the sentences and even imprisonment with respect to those prison officers who may find themselves in those particular situations. Then when you go on and you look at the proposed Section 8B and the other offenses related to prison security, this is where now we're dealing with voice over internet protocols and communication and social media, and to deal with persons making videos, etc., and transmitting it from within prison. And you're right that we've seen the videos. In fact, just yesterday, some were circulated. I think they were old videos of a certain gang or members associated with a gang within prisons carrying on and seem to be smoking certain illicit drugs and saying how they will continue their criminal empires. So we're telling them that is unacceptable, and we're passing legislation specifically to deal with it. But also, as I say, the electric communications that are taking place. A lot of discussion was had about tipping off. And I want to join with the Attorney General in saying that the need for tipping off legislation and to criminalize tipping off with all of the various services that this particular bill seeks to deal with and to capture are necessary. Because just this week, in a particular briefing, the Commissioner of Police, the Chief of Defence Staff, and the Director of our Intelligence Services and myself were being told of just last weekend, a particular operation being planned and about to be implemented, one that had been in the planning for quite a while. And as they set off, it became apparent that there was tipping off. And we're saying that when you do these acts of tipping off, which are the servicemen and women, you're putting at risk the lives of your fellow officers. And we're finding ways, from a practical, logistical point of view, to try and get around it. And this is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately. The criminal tentacles have a way all over the world of reaching from top to bottom. But once again, the Senate today can show its commitment to provide the tools via legislation. And that is all we can do via the Senate and via the House. Provide legislative tools in the fight against crime. And I heard the remarks that the government, all this government has done, or a lot of what this government has done legislatively, is bring legislation to deal with crime. And that is because the commitment of the government is understanding, as I've said on numerous occasions in the Senate over the last few months, the reality of crime and how crime is affecting. And this is what we can do. The passage of pieces of legislation to deal with the evolution of crime that is continuously evolving, almost on a daily and a weekly basis. The legislation must keep up with it. And we can't criticize the bringing of legislation to deal with it. And criticize and say, well, why didn't you do this previously, etc. We can't change the past, we're dealing with it now. We also here are increasing the penalties for prison officers accepting bribes. I think it's obvious why we would want to do that. So what we're saying to the prison officers, and interestingly, just before coming here, I was speaking to Seren Richards, the president of the Prison Officers Association. And they're happy and they're waiting for the passage of this legislation because they worked with us on the creation of this legislation. Importantly, assaults and retaliatory action against prison officers found at the proposed Section 11 amendment to the Prison Service Act. And we're saying any person who assaults, threatens, obstructs, or resists, or aids or incites any other person to assault, threaten, obstruct, or resist a prison officer in the execution of his duty, or any person aiding or assisting a prison officer in the execution of his duty with intent to impede, intimidate, or retaliate against a prison officer while engaged in the execution of his duty commits an offense. Madam President, this is the provision that they're looking for, meaning the prison officers. This is married and coupled with the firearms they've been provided with, the stab vests they've been provided with, the other areas of national security we're working with through multi-agencies to offer our prison officers, the men and women who go out there and do their duty as prison officers, to offer them that extra protection. Not many people would have had the opportunity to tour the prisons and to see what it is that prison officers on a daily basis face and the difficulties of their environment. So whatever we can do to make their lives that much safer, that much more palatable, I say to you, the senators here today, this is one of those occasions that you can assist them. We then, in this bill, move on to deal with the police service. And again, you start off immediately by introducing increased fines and sentences for those who assault or resist or obstruct officers in the exercise of specified functions, in the exercise of their duty. Unfortunately, we see all too often, again via social media, that on occasions when our policemen and women go into certain communities to conduct their duties and to exercise their authority in a lawful manner, what they're faced with and the attitude and the pushback that they get by the community, certain elements of the community. And as we talk about in our briefs, our briefings, and when we're planning, you're seeing very often now the use of women and children when the police officers go in. And they are now being used by the tools to prevent police officers when they're going in to carry out their lawful duties and activities, to prevent them from doing so, to make it more difficult. This is an opportunity for us to send a signal to them. There are certain things that are being done on the operational side, and I'm sure the population will see in the not too distant future. But legislatively, this is the opportunity for us to put down our stamp, to put down our objection to that type of behavior when our men and women in Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the Fire Service and our immigration officers and all of the other officers this covers are carrying out their duty. And I say respectfully, Madam President, it is a most important amendment being made to show the change in times. I'm sure when everyone in here was younger, you would recall when you saw police officers on patrol and the police vehicles going into certain areas, the respect that they were given. Right. We need to show society, and it's the minority of those in society, that we stand up here as legislators and provide that level of support by saying it's not going to be a $500 fine. It's not going to be a $1,000 fine. This is serious when you obstruct police officers in the conduct of their duty. And we're sending a strong signal here. Again, the tipping off. Tipping off is important. This particular offense in dealing with some of the operations, or a lot of the operations that the police service go through. The Commissioner of Police himself and the executive are continuously battling with this problem. You saw the Commissioner of Police yesterday in a press conference talk about how difficult it is sometimes when you have police officers taking photographs and leaking photographs of station diaries, etc. The next section, dealing with police officers, again deals with assaults and action against the police officers. And it's us sending the signal that that is unacceptable. Police officers accepting bribes. There was a particular section in here that when we had dealt with it in the other place, it drew the attention of the public that some people weren't aware of. What we're also doing here is we're seeking in this bill, Madam President, to increase the fines and the penalties for those who provide officers whilst on duty with alcoholic beverages. And persons can immediately understand in our society, and the prevalence of that unfortunately taking place in our society, of this as a fact. Very often I am sent messages and photographs of police officers on duty, or you'll see they'll send me pictures of a police vehicle, a marked police vehicle outside of a bar, or police officers with alcoholic beverages in their hands, driving motor cars, etc. So again, we're sending the signal via legislation that we think this is unacceptable. Immigration. Our immigration officers, so for example, when you go down to, when I went down to Cedrus and I toured the immigration office down there, the officers down in Cedrus told the very real examples that they faced at a time before the registration process, where locals would turn up and threaten them that if they didn't give passage and they didn't allow certain immigrants in, etc., what could happen and these types of things. In fact, we had one incident with an immigration officer up at Piarco saying that she was followed to her vehicle by an individual who is making a living, it appears, out of trafficking of persons. So what we're saying here is we also capture the immigration officers to provide them with that extra assistance. And as I heard Senator Sobers say, the live examples of, unfortunately, the bad apples, even in the immigration service, who may be providing the false stamps or assisting in the committing of illegal offenses and offenses against the Immigration Act. So we're telling them, on the one hand, we'll offer you protection, but on the other hand, we're also going to increase the fines and the penalties if you breach the law and if you engage in corrupt activity. Similar for the fire services. And then customs. So, Madam President, this piece of legislation, as I said at the outset, captures the prisons, the police, the immigration, fire, and customs. And what it is meant to do, quite simply, is on the one hand, offer them increased levels of protection by increasing fines, and in some instances, introducing new criminal offenses that may be committed in those environments. But on the other hand, increasing the levels of responsibility that we expect out of the various men and women in these services. At this juncture, Madam President, through you and through the Senate, I'd like to use the opportunity to thank the men and women who, on a daily basis, 24/7, under these various services, sometimes in extremely difficult circumstances and environments, continue to do their duties and their jobs to make the life of citizens of Trinidad and Tobago a safer one and a better one. So I thank the prison services, the police, immigration, fire, customs. I use the opportunity to tag on there as well the lifeguards, or defense force, or probation officers. And all I'd like to say, Madam Speaker, in this very short contribution, but an important contribution, I'd like to just tell all of the senators that we look forward to your assistance in the passage of this bill and your contributions towards the effective passage of this bill, and the effects that this bill and the specific offenses and the specific increases in penalties and sentences will have on the men and women in these various services. And to thank you all for continuing to have that conscience to help all of these officers make Trinidad and Tobago a safer one. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for allowing me the opportunity to contribute to this debate